What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people. John Adams.
In a crowded room in Philadelphia, delegates crowded together for a greater cause, a common goal.
This was revolutionary. These men would deliberate, debate, and determine their path towards independence and democracy.
Besides fighting the British with guns and cannons, the American Revolution took place in the minds of the people as the conflict progressed and the Patriots continued to resist.
250 years ago, our nation was born.
America's story is veiled in mystique and folklore, marked by tales of valor and bloodshed.
To understand America as we know it, we must understand where it began. I'm Bridget Miller.
I'm Macy Kendrick.
I'm Natalie Miller, and this is the Patriot Papers.
To revolt against your government and against the nation that you identify yourself with is a serious decision. It implies that you don't see reconciliation as a possibility anymore. You also sign on for the risk of losing the fight and the consequences of that.
How does the idea of revolution originate? How does everyone agree to such a risk?
Largely, the people invented it. Key leaders convinced the colonies that the system in place was corrupt and tyrannical, and then they convinced them to fight for self-governance.
The early years of fighting was a defining time, and the Patriots had to fight a war and forge their nation at the same time to actually create a future that they were fighting for.
Today, we're going to bounce back and forth between the military and nation building as we follow the early years of the American Revolution.
The end of the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775 brought New England's militias together in an effort to maintain the ground that they had gained.
The Battle of Lexington and Concord opened the revolution, but the fight had just begun. So, beyond shooting bullets at each other, the colonists had to organize the revolution that they were facilitating. One main way that this happened was via continental congresses. There were two, but let's go in order and focus on the first. So, it's September 1774. This is going to serve as sort of an interim governing body for the colonies. The colonial governments, like we talked about last episode, were controlled by Great Britain to a serious extent, so that's not really going to be effective in doing what they're trying to do. So what was the Continental Congress able to do or produce? Like, what are the things why form one? What's going to happen?
I'm guessing they're concerned with, being able to raise an army. They also have to find a way to fund all of this. Wars cost money.
And obviously they need, a unified body making decisions. If it's just the 13 colonies doing that themselves, then, who knows what's going on?
Yeah, so, you need, it's almost like a representative on, the global scale. The raising an army is spot on. I mean, I feel like that speaks for itself. Trying to start organizing funds and sort of bankrolling this as well, but also just having a global representative. Who is going to be doing the talking with other countries, with Great Britain, or getting word out to your patriots, colonists, people who are on your side. So yeah, just basically a leading body for this. So the first Continental Congress was actually formed in response to the Intolerable Acts, which Natalie gave us the rundown of last episode. And so here we actually only see 12 of the 13 colonies sending representatives. Anyone want to guess who didn't show?
Ooh, I'm gonna go with Rhode Island for some reason. I feel like that's a random guess.
I'm gonna randomly guess Georgia.
It is Georgia, yes. So that's the one who sat out, but everyone else was there. So 12 out of 13 isn't bad. And then there's three main products that come from this Continental Congress. The first one is the drafting of the Declaration of Rights. This is done by Eliphalet Dyer and Roger Sherman. Do you guys want to talk about what that document did at all?
Is this a precursor of the Bill of Rights?
I would say that there's definitely some relations that can be drawn between it, but I feel like it's listing out basically the Declaration of the Rights of the people in the colonies, and sort of it's creating something that you can later cite for you infringed upon this, but we see this as something that we are owed or we have a right to.
So it's kind of a written down version of this British Constitution that we've talked about almost.
Yeah, I would say, except I'm sure Parliament wouldn't have passed this. This isn't really the mother country's wishes written down, but There's a comparison there. They also sent a petition to the king, and this was asking for their grievances to be addressed. So they sent memos of this petition to the colonies, but they did not send one to Parliament.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that some people don't, or they forget about, some colonists were still very loyal to the king. Like, their main issue is with Parliament, because Parliament's the one that's making all of these laws and these taxations against the colonists. But the king, of course, is like, they're still loyal to him, so they're kind of like reaching out to him and saying, can you please help us? Like, can you do something about Parliament?
Yeah, like they're trying to basically get his sympathy against Parliament.
Yeah, this all goes back to the idea that they do really still feel like British citizens, or British subjects, I'm sorry. But it's not, like, you can see here the, like, still continued desire for some form of reconciliation or just having the grievances to be addressed. Like, they're not declaring independence yet. They're just creating documents to sort of ask for things to be fixed and amended, and they're going to the king for it. The third one is something that I admittedly didn't know a lot about before researching it, and yet it's still super important. So this is called the Association. Have you guys any familiarity?
I can't say that I've heard about it.
It sounds very vague.
Yes, it was like very daunting almost. Like, what does that even mean? Although I will say this is like not like as threatening and vague as it may sound. It was basically an agreement between the representatives at the Continental Congress. So they were agreeing to completely abstain from importing, buying, or using goods from Britain. And so the agreement was made between the representatives, but they were supposed to implement this in their respective colonies. So this was going to be spread out between all colonists.
Oh, so like an economic boycott.
Yeah, it was sort of like an ultimatum, too, because they agreed to follow this until Parliament repealed the oppressive laws in the colonies. So it's like, we're going to do this until you fix it, and then we'll undo what we're doing. So intending to enact some hurt. So how do you guys think this was received?
Well, I imagine Parliament didn't love that it got sent, and we know how the rest of the revolution goes, so I'm guessing the king doesn't meet these demands.
Yeah. So largely, the British government and the mother country isn't really gonna give this the time of day. First of all, they're not gonna be like, oh, okay, let's now remove all the oppressive laws we have. They're just gonna be teed off, yeah.
And for the colonist side, I'm feeling this is sort of like a unifying event, whereas like they had been these 13 distinct colonies, they're now coming together kind of behind this idea of we have a united front against this oppression.
Yeah, I would say that more or less they got there, although this really did take some enforcing. So the Continental Congress is generally, this one is largely an advisory body. They're extra legal, remember. They don't have real authority. So they did actually turn to colonies themselves and localities to establish committees to enforce this, because I'm sure this boycott might not have been easy in all respects, and a lot of people probably weren't maybe extremely willing to do this, but due to establishing these committees, it did get enforced. And it's important to talk about the committees because they do create de facto governing bodies. They're basically forming new branches of government that are outside of the one Britain has put in the colonies. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about in regards to the First Continental Congress is generally, what did people think about Continental Congresses being created, like just the body in general?
I mean, this is a major, I think, upset to the British. The colonists are essentially making some type of, like you said, extra legal governing system, which is definitely a stab in the back. And sort of, if I were a British parliamentarian, I would be concerned about the colonies making their own form of government.
Yeah.
And this is going beyond kind of just tensions and violent protests. They're actually gathering together to make legislative ideas and documents. So this is kind of showing just how serious the colonies are about what's going on.
That's a great point. Yeah, combining what both of you said, they're doing serious infractions against British governance in the colonies, and they're also organized in a way that's now becoming threatening. This isn't just, a skirmish of colonists who happen to have guns and they are using them. This is an organized body that is leading a movement against you. This should be concerning and threatening.
Yeah, it's sort of so what? They shot each other at Lexington and Concord. It's a skirmish, it's a violent fight, whatever, but this is what's actually threatening. Of course, the British have the best militia army in the world, but ideas of making their own government. Like, it's not something that can't really be quelled easily by an army per se. Like, it's in the minds of the people at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of push that down. And I will say, while we're talking about Great Britain, just to make it clear for everyone, George III and his ministers were not happy about receiving the petition. Parliament that didn't receive it at all. They, of course, I don't even think he answered the petition. He certainly didn't support or give them what they wanted, but I think he completely just ignored it. However, I will say there were some British citizens who respected the message being sent. Perhaps it was because they're empathetic to the issues felt in the colonies, but there were some British citizens certainly who had an understanding or respect for colonial sentiment. In the colonies, generally, how was the Continental Congress received?
I guess if I was a colonist and I was kind of on the fence, but now I kind of see this body coming together, I would be more willing to really join the Patriot cause and get behind it. Like, this is no longer like a small radical group from Boston. It's kind of like, okay, 12 of the 13 colonies are coming together, sending representatives for this. So I'm kind of feeling a bit of, like, I guess, national pride almost in this.
Mm-hmm. Spot on. Of course, there's people who aren't going to want to agree with it. Like, Tory writers popped up and attacked the documents coming out by this Congress. But a lot of people, largely, they got the support for the association, the boycott. And, you know, a lot of colonists really do, they relate to these issues being talked about. So they really do feel that sort of, like, connection to it. And then just to conclude, the First Continental Congress didn't achieve much reconciliation. I'm sorry to break the news to both of you, which is what it had set out to do, reconcile. King and Parliament just didn't want to cooperate. But they did achieve things like the Declaration of Rights and the Association facilitating unity, like we talked about.
So, like I just mentioned, Lexington and Concord is, of course, the shot heard around the world. After that, however, the Massachusetts militia surrounded the British in Boston. While this was happening in Boston, a separate plan was being put in motion to target a British fort near Lake Champlain, which is northwest of Boston. So they were planning to target this fort. It's called Fort Ticonderoga, which I think you've probably heard of before.
I have heard that mentioned before.
I don't want to spoil any of the story, but doesn't this have something to do with, like, cannons later?
Yeah. So I think you can probably take a wild guess at what they're going there to get. It's not like, new, like, clothes or anything.
No new shoes and marching gear?
No. The fort does hold valuable British artillery and ammunition, which is what the militia needs and wants. And as they're holding Boston under siege, this is going to become valuable. Less than a month after Lexington and Concord, the New England militia, led by two men, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, who we'll get into that later. I'm sure you've heard that name before.
Does sound just slightly familiar.
Yes. But let's not count him off just yet, because he is important to Fort Ticonderoga. They surprised British troops at Fort Ticonderoga, who surrender without a fight. They go up there and they just sort of give over the fort. And the Patriots do end up taking the supplies to be hauled all the way back to Boston to be used by the militia. However, they had to wait to move the cannons, which are an important piece of artillery. Anyone want to guess why they had to wait?
Didn't they have to wait for the snow so they could, essentially, almost sled them back?
Yeah, this is very, counterintuitive. You'd think that they didn't want to move them in winter. My mind would go to, it'd be, easier to move them during, pleasant weather. But no, yeah, they needed the snow to allow the cannons to be transported back by sled. Of course, carrying a cannon, although I've never tried it, is probably a little bit difficult.
I'm imagining walking to the market or something and just seeing a group of people sledding cannons.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how I'd react to that.
Yeah, certainly a sight to behold. Once back in Boston, the artillery and the ammunitions enforce the British evacuation of Boston, which happens way later than the other events. So they do the British don't leave Boston right away. They're there for a while.
These are regular colonial men fighting this war. They don't have forts of their own. Their government actually just created itself, or is still in the process of doing that. So stealing cannons is how they're going to get cannons.
Yeah, you're totally right. And at this point, remember, they don't really have any allies either. They're doing this pretty much by themselves. Basically, the significance here is this is a major morale boost to the Patriot cause. In Lexington and Concord, the Patriots had been on the defensive, but now at Ticonderoga, they're on the offensive. So anytime, you're doing something for the first time, fighting a revolution, being on the offensive is going to be a morale boost to the troops, and that's sort of exactly what this is.
Okay, I'm going to take back over, and now we're going to talk about the Second Continental Congress. This would be starting in August of 1775. It would last a while, and it would be different from the first. So while the first one operated mostly as an advisory committee, as I kept pointing out, this Congress had a more aggressive approach. I'm sure that's from seeing the way that the first one was received, but it's a different attitude this time. And at this point, fighting had begun. Revolutionary attitudes in the colonies are more developed. So their goal now is to establish American rights. And the use of force also wasn't out of the question. So last time we talked about how they were drafting documents and boycott agreements. What do you think their orders of business might be now?
I would go with things that are more tactile, like action items. Of course, like documentation and asking for reconciliation is important, and it was a necessary first step. But now I'm thinking they're turning towards more actionable,
Like kind of like the administrative side of like, we're fighting a revolution now.
Yeah.
We have to get our stuff together.
Absolutely, and that matches the aggressive approach. So they're establishing things like an army and a postal system, both very necessary to what's going on. They're sending resolutions to colonies to create militias. They got to find their fighting force as well. They're gathering supplies and they're arming ships. Their attitude is now very much fight back, like you guys both pointed out. So between the time they had received something called Lord North's reconciliatory proposal. It offered pretty much any colony that contributed to public defense of Great Britain and supported the civil government, Great Britain's civil government in the colonies. And it gave these colonies an exemption from taxation. Do you guys think that this was a genuine attempt of British reconciliation?
I mean, here's my thing. I feel like at this point, things are a little bit too far gone. After Lexington and Concord, people have been killed over this, and I think that a paper document just proposing that, oh, you can come back, like, if you want to follow these rules, like, we can reconcile things. I feel like it's a little bit too far gone at this point, now that people have died over this.
Also, how are the states going to get the money to send for this, like, defense fund? It's going to be, I'm guessing, through taxing the citizens. It would just be through the state instead of through Britain, so it's kind of the same situation almost.
Yeah, and it's reinforcing the idea that, like, you will be taxed and it will go to Great Britain. And it's really just, I mean, it's reconciliation, but at the cost of, like, you must submit your loyalty to us again and do so financially. So, needless to say, Congress is not interested. They do not accept this reconciliatory proposal. And they also wrote a lot. This is a key theme with the Founding Fathers. A lot of stuff is getting put to paper. So they make addresses to the people of Ireland, Canada, and some native nations. Ireland and Canada are also British possessions. It's probably trying to reach out and form a sense of solidarity. Now, how much success that actually got, not sure. And then native nations were also contacted in addresses as well. And then they drafted a commission and instruction for George Washington. What do you guys think he's going to be doing?
Leading the army.
A lot.
Yes, yeah. So while they're creating the Continental Army, someone's got to be in charge of it. They're going to go for Washington. Great pick, in my opinion.
Me as well.
They write another petition to the king. To the king specifically, I should
They're really
make that clear.
holding out for the king.
Yep, not Parliament fans. This is called the Olive Branch Petition. Perhaps you've heard of it. This is really going to be the final attempt to appeal to the king personally and avoid full-scale war. So like you said, fighting's happened, but I think they're trying to see just if any avenues are still open. So what do you think George III does when he sees this?
Well, considering he ignored the first one, I don't think his feelings have changed. If anything, maybe they, like, hardened. So I'm going to say he threw that bad boy out.
George III rejected it. Yep, you are spot on, Macy.
$20 to Macy.
Yeah, and I can't lie. In George III's defense, it probably didn't help that they produced Declaration on Taking Up Arms at the same time. This is a document explaining that why they were arming themselves against the British. So, you know, I gotta give them a little bit of credit. But generally, this Second Continental Congress closed the door on peaceful settlement. That is done. That is I think they know they're too far gone now. And it's not a huge surprise because, again, Natalie said fighting's already begun.
Okay, so back to this cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. Like I mentioned, the Patriots wanted to take supplies, like the cannon, from Ticonderoga with the goal of taking everything back to Boston to try and retake the city. None of the supplies would arrive right away. They would arrive in the following winter, like I said. But by June, the Patriots would have to fight anyway. In the evening of June 16th and 17th, 1775, about 1,200 Patriot men in Boston moved into the neck of the city, which is situated on higher ground. The neck is important because it's on the outskirts of the city, giving them easier control of Boston, and then of course, it's on higher ground. That's an important piece in any kind of military situation. So they set up entrenchments on Breed's Hill. The British army that's in Boston see this happening and attacked the morning of June 17th. So the British were headed up this way regardless in an attempt to occupy two hills looking over the city, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. And if they could do this, they could regain control of Boston. Okay, so does anyone want to take a guess at... Do you guys remember who won this battle?
Was it the British?
Yeah. So the British do defeat the Patriots as they retreat from Boston Neck, and it is a British victory, but a costly one. About 1,000 redcoats were killed and wounded. Yeah.
That's a lot. I actually did not realize it was that many.
Yeah, so that is a significant number of killed and wounded. And the Americans actually only suffered about 400 wounded and killed, and over about 3,000 Patriots fought in these battles. So the Americans were defeated, but they did suffer less casualty, which will come into play later. As we know, they have a pretty ragtag fighting force, so suffering major losses early on would be not so good.
Yeah.
This does become the main battle of the Siege of Boston, which lasted until 1776. In come George Washington, where he took control of the situation in Boston and spent a lot of his time trying to build up the Patriot forces to challenge the British again after this loss. But the British will continue to hold Boston for now, and we will leave Boston there and come back to it later. But just know the British are going to continue to hold. Okay. In June of 1775, the American Continental Congress had heard reports that the British forces in Canada were preparing for an invasion of New York. The Patriots had hopes that Canada would become America's 14th colony. So the Continental Congress authorized the seizure of important points in Canada necessary to protect the colonies. Obviously, the British trying to come into the United States by way of New York is a little bit threatening. The Patriots had launched a twofold invasion of Canada led by Montgomery and partially Colonel Benedict Arnold, who we'll come back to in just a second. So the Patriots left from Massachusetts with about 1,100 men, and they arrived in Quebec in early November with only 650 men. So they did lose some along the way, but they still do have a...
Is this like to sickness or like kind of just abandon the cause?
I'm not exactly sure. If I had to guess, it's probably a little bit of both. They then had to wait for the arrival of General Richard Montgomery, who was coming from Fort Ticonderoga. Eventually, Montgomery does join Arnold in Quebec in early December, but with only about 300 men. So they're not really getting as much men as they had originally planned to do this attack with. The rest stayed behind to hold Montreal. The Patriots did decide to attack that night on December 30th and December 31st.
At this time, isn't it that like the Continental Army, like their contracts are for 1 year, right? So basically, on January 1st, all of these men are technically no longer enlisted, like they're not forced to fight.
You're exactly correct, Macy. I think it's interesting to note this is something that we see come up a lot in military history and the history of war itself. Like in Vietnam, this was also a thing. Like people were waiting out, leaving the day that they were allowed to leave. This is not something that's unique to this war.
Yeah, generally it's good for morale, or I'm speaking on more specifically Vietnam. It's good for morale of the people who can just put their nose down for 1 year or however long it is, but it does create flaws in areas such as this, because now you're we have one more day with these people here, and well, I guess we'll do it anyway. It's interesting to see how this shows up, this theme of just put your head down, do it for 1 year, consistently in history and this early on as well. So they do decide to attack because enlistments were about to expire on January 1st. The British do repel this attack and wounded and killed about 100 Patriots. Again, not a staggering number. And General Montgomery was among those killed. Benedict Arnold also suffered injury as well. Quebec does mark the first major Patriot loss of the Revolution so far. Despite this, though, the Americans continued to hold the city of Montreal until the spring of 1776, where the British drove the Patriots back towards Lake Champlain. Now, Benedict Arnold, what do you guys know?
I don't want to, spoil the story, but he becomes known as America's first traitor, correct?
Yeah, this is definitely what he's known for. His legacy is he is America's most notorious, maybe, traitor. So as we've seen, we've sort of heard that he's sacrificed a lot, including getting injured in this battle. And he then gets passed up kind of time and time again for promotion by the Continental Congress. And this is a little bit frustrating to him. So he does continue to ruffle some feathers with the Continental Congress, but it's in 1780 when he officially commits treason against the United States of America. Do you guys know anything about the story about Arnold and how he committed treason?
Wasn't he actually caught with, like, materials on him?
So essentially, he's in command of West Point, which is like a military base, in 1780 when he began to conspire to turn the fort over to the British.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so not just like material, but like the entire fort. That's his plan, essentially. The reason why is a little bit less clear. I think it's possible that he could have been upset because of the grudges that he held for being overlooked by the Continental Congress. He was also in an immense amount of debt. He had a lot of debt. Maybe this was a way to pay it off. Also important to mention that his wife had notable loyalist ties. Mm-hmm. So that could have been part of it too. Historians do debate on why he did this. But essentially, he and one of his co-conspirators are caught with damning evidence on them both. Arnold narrowly escapes onto a British ship where he officially switches sides and becomes a brigadier general in the British Army. So he kind of gets off scot-free. Kind of a loaded question. Do you guys think that he was justified in his treason, basically?
I'm going to go with no on this one.
Yeah.
I think that even if you are in debt, maybe betraying your country and trying to give up a fort to the British is not the best look necessarily.
Stepping away from talking about treason for a little bit and returning to the action-packed side of the revolution, conflict does continue. At the beginning of 1776, Loyalists and Patriots clashed violently in North Carolina. Let's talk about Moores Creek. And so this semester we actually traveled to the historic Royal Governor's Palace in New Bern, North Carolina. On our tour, Josiah Martin was mentioned. Do you guys remember anything about him?
He was the royal governor, correct?
He was, yes, he was one of them, and he was the last one.
Wasn't he also the first royal governor to flee?
Yeah, so he was among the first to flee. So after he did that, it wasn't really over for him. He and Great Britain created a plan to reestablish royal authority in North Carolina. So he started rounding up loyalist militiamen on his march toward Wilmington. And so the Patriots found out about this, and a colonel named Richard Caswell was a Patriot leader, and he was instructed to sort of confront the Loyalists at a crossing on Moores Creek. So there's 1,000 Patriot men and 1,600 Loyalists. So the battle's actually super quick. I think it happens in a matter of minutes. So the Loyalists have the number advantage, like I said, but the Patriots had the element of surprise.
I've always heard the element of surprise is what you want, so...
Yeah, like even if you're outnumbered, if they're not prepared to fight, it doesn't really, matter as much.
Yeah.
Catch them off guard.
Yeah, so the crossing where they confronted them was actually where a bridge was. The Loyalists were going to cross Moores Creek through this bridge. And so besides having the element of surprise, the Patriots did things like grease parts of the bridge and remove some planks.
Oh, that sounds like almost like very Home Alone of them. Like I'm
Yes.
imagining like the burglars and like the paint.
Yeah,
Yes.
this is definitely a unique and special...
It's almost like cartoonishly funny.
Yeah.
It's crafty, but it worked.
crafty, that's a good way to describe
So 70 Loyalists were killed and 850 were taken prisoner. On the Patriot side, there was one casualty, but it occurred 4 days after the battle itself. So post-battle recap, huge Patriot victory. They got a lot of prisoners, and they won, and they suffered very minimal losses.
One.
Like
Yes.
about as minimal as you can
Yes,
get.
yes. So beyond the Patriots winning this battle, what is the significance, do you think, of Moores Creek?
Well, I guess after like kind of almost an embarrassing defeat in Canada, like this is kind of putting the Patriots a little bit back on the right steps. And also this is kind of the first one we've talked about in the South.
Yeah, you got to think that they're confronting them in the context of Loyalists trying to go reclaim the government. So stopping this at this battle and winning this battle means that plan is foiled. So permanent end of royal authority in North Carolina. Josiah Martin failed. And it also partly inspired the provincial government of North Carolina to endorse the vote for independence, which is, ongoing at this time. And this battle, like you said, would have given Loyalists a foothold in the South, but Patriots managed to prevent that for now. So, continuing our focus on the southern colonies, Charleston, South Carolina was a port city of importance to the British. They thought that taking key ports like Charleston would allow them to gain control of the South, again, looking for this foothold, and then make it easier to defeat the Patriots. This inspired them to attempt the first siege on Charleston in June of 1776. So, South Carolina Patriots are led by Charles Lee. Does anyone recognize that name?
I do, from Hamilton the Musical, of all places.
Yes, yeah. In the context he's mentioned in Hamilton is like the Battle of Monmouth, I think, so a little bit different. But here, he really is a standout Patriot guy that we're going to be rooting for. So Lee and Patriots actually used a fortification on Sullivan's Island. That's an island situated in Charleston Harbor, and it was able to cut off British ships from entering. So a good sort of hold fortification to have. And besides the actual fighting, the British failed in trying to attempt a siege on Charleston. They would not make another attempt for 3 years after this defeat, so this absolutely postponed the British foothold in the South, and, Patriot victory always stirs up some support, and South Carolina now feels that sort of sentiment. And now we have reached the point that many people know. The drafting of the Declaration of Independence, perhaps one of the most well-known parts of the American Revolution. This document is so pivotal and legendary in the history of America's beginnings. No, the Declaration does not predate all of the fighting in the Revolution, as we have seen, but it did serve to formalize cutting ties between the colonies and the British Empire. They explicitly say that the king is facilitating tyranny. So what are the main facets of the Declaration of Independence that you guys remember?
It lists basically all of the colonists' grievances with the king, correct?
It does do
this
that.
is why we want independence, because you've done X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, it's making it really clear.
It also says that, a ruler, the king per se, is, if he's doing all these things that are impeding on rights, the colonists do have a right to make their own government, overthrow him, essentially.
Yeah, so it's introducing this idea of, consent of the governed. The people in the colonies are not consenting to the things that they list specifically, the grievances they have, and that when a government is so tyrannical, the people's right and duty is to abolish it and make a new one. Also, a really important thing is the unalienable rights that are included in the Declaration. Anyone want to list those off?
I'll start if y'all follow.
Go ahead.
Life.
Liberty. And the pursuit of happiness, absolutely. These are very well cited in the Declaration of Independence. Additionally, some of the specific grievances that were included, like Macy was talking about, is they kept standing armies among the colonists during peacetime. Looking back to Boston, like we spoke about, they imposed taxes without their consent. This is the major...
Really big theme.
Yeah, this is the big one. Cut off their trade with the world. We're talking about mercantilism here, but their view is just cutting them off. And then inconveniencing or oppressing colonial legislatures, dissolving them indefinitely. So after listing these grievances, the Declaration claims that when they previously petitioned the British government about these issues, they were insulted in their response, quoting, patient sufferance. So it's like, we tried to reconcile, and you did not seem like you wanted to at all, so you forced our hand. And then they conclude that they must declare the British government an enemy, and because the citizens of Great Britain stand by the King and Parliament, they also are declared enemies. At the same time, they're cutting ties from Great Britain and gaining independence and declaring war. So a lot of things going on in this document. All 13 colonies signed, but New York originally abstained for a while until finally being the 13th to sign. And do you guys remember that fun detail about the date of the Declaration of Independence?
I'm thinking that it wasn't actually signed on July 4th, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember in our American Revolution class we talked about, isn't it July 2nd that it was actually voted upon or something?
Yeah, so July 2nd is the day that the Continental Congress voted for independence and adopted the Declaration of Independence. I think it was John Adams talking about how Americans would celebrate with fireworks on July 2nd for years to come. He was really looking forward to that sort of holiday on July 2nd, but he was just slightly off. So July 4th is the day that the document is dated, and actually the signing ceremony, some of the signatures didn't happen until August.
Oh,
so
wow.
Not really just July 4th.
Okay, so the Declaration of Independence isn't the only important document being written during this time. 1776 was also the year that many states began writing their own state constitutions. Obviously, we're quite a few years off from the federal constitution, but state constitutions are really important. So in June of this year, Virginia adopts its state constitution, and it starts with the Bill of Rights, which is going to be an important part of all these constitutions. And in many ways, these serve as basically a response to the issues that colonists had with the British leading up to the Revolution. So kind of those grievances we just talked about in the Declaration of Independence, those are kind of being relisted and addressed in these constitutions. For like a quick example, in Section 13 of Virginia's Constitution, it discusses how state militias are important for, and I quote, safe defense of a free state, but a standing army in times of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty.
I imagine that, despite being somewhat of a united country or a confederation of states, these are different colonies and states.
Yeah, I mean, also important to know that they aren't thinking of themselves as a unified body just yet. Like, they're thinking of themselves as sort of independent entities from each other.
Yeah, that's correct. And also, even when they were British colonies, they all kind of had different colonial makeup and how their government worked. So that kind of leads into how their constitutions are written. So while they are very similar in a lot of ways, like I've mentioned, they all start with this Bill of Rights, and they kind of give power to the people. None of them are setting up a king or anything. Shocking. They do differ in a lot of key ways, mostly doing with like the legislator branch. So like Pennsylvania has just one house elected by taxpayers. Massachusetts has a bicameral legislature, so a Senate and a House. We're kind of seeing how this will be taken later for the Constitution, but I won't spoil that story. And then Virginia also has this, but both houses are equal representation. So for the House, it's chosen by these county voters, and then for the Senate, it's chosen by voters of a district. So this can include like multiple counties. And then actually only Massachusetts had a way to amend their state constitution, interestingly enough, at this time. Okay, so do you guys see the creation of these state constitutions so early into the war kind of more as a sign of just like preparedness to govern themselves without Britain, or a sign of like loyalty residing more within the state than necessarily like a unified nation?
You're getting at a lot here that I think will come up a lot later. Of course, we know that there's later debates about if states should have more rights rather than like a federal system. I venture to say that I think that they are doing a little bit of both. I think they're smart to be setting up a government and not just like waiting until after the fighting is done. Clearly they know that they're going to have something post-revolution if they win at this point. And then second, I do think that putting a lot of the power within the state is a direct response to having this quote-unquote tyrannical king ruling over them and keeping government close to home, if you will.
Yeah, because this king is, an ocean away, and now at least your state government is at farthest, maybe a few days ride on your horse and buggy, but much closer in proximity than maybe the national government meeting in Philadelphia at the time. Okay, so lastly, let's jump back into the military side to end out 1776. So actually things aren't looking great. We've talked about some wins and some losses, but on the whole, it's kind of showing that the colonists are kind of these normal people in militias. They are not a professional army themselves. We've mentioned one thing that's important, and I'm just going to bring it back up again, this idea that the Patriot forces are really serving on these one-year contracts. So when January 1st hits, the people in the army are like, they're gone. Like, there is no force. And this continues to be an issue, and a large amount of this army is like returning home at the same time. Okay, so near the end of 1776, it kind of seemed that the Patriot cause had like lost a lot of momentum in the North. Washington himself had described feeling that New Jersey had basically all but abandoned the Patriot cause. So this leads to like another question for you guys. New England had kind of been like this hotbed of revolution, as we talked about. And it's like essentially where like these flames sparked for the revolution itself. So why do you think the military like saw such difficulty there the last half of 1776?
I mean, the army is like pretty heavily in New England, so I'm guessing there's probably some like loyalist sentiment. And then not to mention like if you have the army of the guys you're fighting against living in the city and like holding like siege over places, you might be a little bit less inclined to be like a outspoken revolutionary.
I also imagine you get fatigued the longer you're in something. Maybe the fight got to the south later, and so they're more in that, like, I don't want to say honeymoon phase, but like that beginning where you're really inspired and you have a lot of momentum going. But when you sort of get into the like rut of it, which is probably where New England is, you hit some difficulty.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. Like, New England has been seeing this now for much longer than the South. Of course, the South has some things going on like we've talked about, but New England is really the heart of the revolution here, and so they're kind of, they're getting strained by it. So, like, colonists and the Patriot forces really need a win in the North and fast to basically boost morale, and this win does come, interestingly enough, on Christmas Day of 1776. So Washington and his men, they cross an icy Delaware River and land about 9 miles north of Trenton, New Jersey. They surprised a group of loyalist Hessian soldiers that were stationed there, and this battle becomes known as the Battle of Trenton. So 948 Hessians are taken prisoner by Washington and his men, and Washington doesn't lose a single man.
Wow.
That is just about as much of an ideal victory as you could get. This
is another great example of, like, surprise is really your best friend in these kind of situations. Like, even though these troops are like, this is a professional army, and obviously Washington's men are far from that, but they have the advantage here because of surprise. But we do see Washington's knowledge on retreating coming back in handy. This will be a constant theme we'll talk about as these episodes continue. But British troops obviously hear about what have happened, and they're coming to counterattack Washington and his men. But luckily for Washington, they're able to kind of slip away before the British arrive. And this is Washington's first, like, real major win, and kind of sets him up for another victory in Princeton soon after. So New Jersey is kind of turning a little bit more towards the Patriot cause. So the scene of Washington crossing the Delaware is, like, pretty iconic. Like, it becomes almost a symbol of American national pride, I would say. So, while both of these victories might be seen as kind of modest, they do, like I said, turn the political tide in favor of the Patriots in New Jersey and in New England. And then seeing the strain that these one-year contracts have on the Army, Congress kind of decides to end doing that and switch them to be 3-year contracts.
Good plan.
So a little bit more time to buy. Okay, so we talked about the Patriots a bit. Let's go to the British side of things and their strategy going into 1777. So Sir Burgoyne had this idea of a 3-pronged attack. So basically, he himself would go south via Lake Champlain to Albany. So he was going to start north near Montreal and depart in June. And then second, Colonel St. Ledger was going to gather support from natives and then meet up with Burgoyne in Albany. So he started west on a fort near Lake Ontario and headed east. And then third, William Howe through the Hudson would recover New York and isolate New England. So he's going to head north from his starting point of New York City.
I mean, militarily, I think this is clear that this is another clear sign that the British have this really well-trained army. It's the best army in the world at this point. So they have these tactics and like ways to really make a strategic advance, whereas the Patriots don't necessarily have this, maybe minus Washington.
Yeah, the British Army has been involved in wars for centuries and centuries at this point. They have the experience that the colonists don't have, and obviously they're seeing the benefits of attacking from multiple angles and not just going with all your men at one front. So in August of 1777, Patriot forces actually found victory at both Bennington in Vermont and then Mohawk Valley. And 1777 is really a turning point for the Continental Army. So we're going into the Battle of Saratoga, and Patriot forces are in a much more favorable spot than they have been just a few months prior. But we won't touch on that battle yet. We'll save that for next episode.
As the events in this episode reveal, the early years of fighting were much more of a work in progress.
In many regards, the colonists were winging it. They were drafting their independence, constitutions, and creating their military.
Compare that to Great Britain, who has been established for a while, and their military was not in its infancy like the colonies.
Regardless, the Americans were able to achieve key victories and establish strong institutions in the early years of fighting.
These wins, both militarily and politically in the early years of the war, were important for creating more concrete support for the Patriot cause.
However, it's important to remember that there are 13 colonies with very different cultures, industries, and relationships with the growing revolution that's heating up.
The American Revolution was primarily a civil war. Neighbor fought against neighbor. For colonists, where you lived mattered in terms of how you felt the entire revolutionary cause.